All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third vaccine question town hall. I'm here this evening with Dr. Sharon Straus of Unity Health St. Michael's, Dr. Melody Wren of also St. Michael's, am I correct?
Yeah.
And Dr. Kevin Gough as well. And Christine Fahim, of course, who's we've been working with for a long time. We're just going to be answering some questions tonight. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat section. You're all free to ask questions. We can't have everyone off the microphone this evening because it'll create a chaos effect. So we're going to be doing these questions. I'm running the thing solo with some co-hosts with Dr. Straus and Dr. Fahim, and we're going to get through this. So Dr. Straus, if I can press you to, I'm not sure if I have anything to say. So.
Great, thanks so much. No, but thank you very much, Ian, for organizing this, and thanks to all your members for their questions and their interest and enthusiasm in hearing more about what's going on with the vaccine. So I'm just gonna hand it off to Ian then to start us with our questions, and again, just encouraging people to use either the Q&A or chat, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So thank you very, very much, and thanks to Dr. Gough and Dr. Wren for joining tonight.
No problem. Give me one moment here. I'm just going to pull up the questions for this evening. So one of the first questions that we had sent in from our group, and I'm just going to dive in if that's okay. So the first question, we'll dive right in here. I don't take flu shots, so I'm hesitant about the COVID vaccine. Is not taking that vaccine a choice, or from where the cases are those PSWs not vaccinated going to be allowed to work, as in the PSW community? And then they're going on a question about $3 or more. So let's ask that first part. If someone habitually does not take the flu shot, okay, and they're basing their hesitancy, in this case, it's hesitancy around that, what kind of advice or reassurances can these individuals get?
So I guess I can start with that one. So yes, receiving the COVID-19 vaccine is completely voluntary at this stage. Unlike the influenza vaccine, for example, which has been around for a while, certain organizations may have stipulations about what will happen if you're not vaccinated or immune, and there's an outbreak in the area that you're working on. You may be required to take Tamiflu or to be redeployed to work in another area, for example. Or if there's no other place for you to work, then you'd be off work. Either with or without pay, depending on the organization. With COVID-19, it's very different because there is no therapy at present, so you don't have an option to take a medication if you choose not to be vaccinated. So as of now, it is voluntary, and what we want to do is to encourage people to receive the vaccine and try to work on why it is that people don't want to receive the vaccine. If it's a clear allergy to a component of it, that's one issue. But if it's around trying to share information and broaden understanding about the vaccine to answer any questions to allow you to feel comfortable taking it, then I think that's time very well spent. So the short answer is, as of now, it's not mandatory, but we hope to encourage people to take it by answering any questions you might have.
That's a great. Can I ask another sub question to that? Because the association gets kind of bits and pieces of questions sometimes. And one of the concerns is that I've had a bad reaction, for example, in the past to a flu shot. It gave me the effects really badly. The cure was worse than the disease in some cases. That's more anecdotal. Can you answer to that at all? Has there been any cases where one person who has traditionally had a bad experience with a flu shot is okay to get, or are we still early on this, or is there no issue at all?
Melody?
I asked that.
I think, sorry, go ahead. Oh, can't hear you. Okay.
Dr. Wren, or whoever wants.
Yeah.
It just comes up through a lot. We get
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think just because you've had a reaction to one particular vaccine, and it depends on the severity of the reaction as well. A lot of vaccines, in fact, most vaccines give you sort of mild symptoms, mild to moderate pain in the arms, swelling, that sort of thing. Some people get muscle aches and a low-grade fever, usually goes away in a day or two. That's completely normal. That happens with all of the vaccines. If you've had a true allergic reaction to the flu vaccine, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a reaction to another vaccine, including the COVID vaccine. They're made of different materials, different ingredients, and sometimes people will have a reaction to one of the particular ingredients in the vaccine, and that can happen, but all of the vaccines are not created equally. So the short answer is that just because you have a severe reaction to one vaccine, it doesn't mean you'll get it with the COVID-19 vaccine. If you're somebody who has a lot of serious allergic reactions and you're seeing an allergist, you carry an EpiPen, that sort of thing, we would encourage you to speak with your healthcare provider about that, just to make sure that it's safe for you to receive that vaccine.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that answers a lot of the questions. That's wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Rand, do you have anything to add, or did Dr. Gough got that pretty good?
I think Dr. Gough did an excellent job. I think the other thing we have to think about in this case is that we know, COVID in the last year has killed over 2 million people. And so when people think about flu versus COVID, the disease entities themselves are going to be quite different as well. So you mentioned that one line about, the vaccine being worse than the flu themselves. I think that would probably be different in this case.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. So keeping along that line, let's go back into a little bit more of an allergic reaction. But the next sub-question from a different individual is asking, would the people who are traditionally allergic to these vaccines, or as far as we're aware so far, are they suffering more sensitivity to it than those who typically don't? This might be a rather specific question, so I'm not sure if the answer exists. But so if I'm someone I traditionally get allergic reactions, I'm sensitive to allergens, I have an EpiPen. Have you seen any evidence of those with those conditions having a more adverse reaction either at all? Has there been any evidence of that?
So it's a good point. You'll remember early on with the Pfizer vaccine, when it first came out, there were 2 healthcare workers in the United Kingdom who had very serious reactions to that. And when they dug deep into the information about those people, they carried EpiPens and they had severe allergic reactions as you described. Even in that case, it wasn't proven that the vaccine caused that. But people that are allergic to have high sensitivity to a lot of agents and are allergic to a lot of things could potentially be more likely to develop a reaction to any vaccine or to a number of medications. So along the same lines as the last response I was telling you about, if you're one of those people, it's a really good idea to have a discussion with your allergist or with your healthcare provider who looks after you with your allergies to say, hey, is this something that's safe for me? Can we look at the ingredients? Can we look at my particular situation? And can I safely receive this vaccine? And most of the time, the answer is yes.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. N, I'm sorry, I want to make sure everyone's included. Is that good?
No, that's great. Thanks for trying to include me. For those who are also not familiar with how the vaccine is being administered, at all the vaccine sites, they're going to actually ask you to sit in the clinic area for an extra 15 minutes after receiving the vaccine, specifically to monitor you to make sure that you don't develop any allergic reactions as like an extra safety precaution for those who haven't had any vaccines yet.
That's excellent. And actually, I want to apologize. I failed to introduce your area specifically of expertise. I was wondering if you can just overview that very quickly now, so our audience might help to direct some future questions. Dr. Rain, can I press on you to just tell us your specialty so we can frame the questions better?
Yeah, sure. So I'm one of the infectious diseases fellows at the University of Toronto.
Oh, okay, thank you. And Dr. Gough, please.
I'm an infectious disease doc. Yeah. So Melody and I work together.
Excellent. Okay, so we have 2 experts in infectious disease, so I can't think of anyone we'd rather be speaking with this evening. So let's take the next question. A bit more general, breastfeeding mothers. This comes up, we get this question quite regularly. Is it safe for breastfeeding mothers? If one is currently in the process of breastfeeding a child, is it safe to take the vaccine? And whoever wants to start.
So I can take this one, Dr. Gough.
Sure.
So currently there's no data about the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine in pregnancy or during breastfeeding because these individuals were excluded from the clinical trials for the vaccines. I would say that for people who are pregnant, who are breastfeeding, who fall into that category of increased risk of exposure, so certainly the PSW group, And if they have any increased risk factors, such as things like pre-existing medical conditions, it's probably worthwhile having a discussion with your healthcare provider to really assess the balance of the risks and benefits to be made on a case-by-case basis, depending on what those factors are for you.
So I guess the question would be, is there any element of the vaccine that would be passed on through the breast milk, obviously, and so far we don't know that there's nothing,
Yeah.
there's no reason to believe that there's any concern.
Well, there's just been no, pregnant women and breastfeeding women had actually been excluded from the trial. So there actually hasn't been any study specifically in those populations to indicate one way or another. We do know that the severity of COVID-19 in people who have specific pre-existing medical conditions such as heart disease, hypertension can be quite high, in addition to taking into consideration people's ages. So I think it probably would be a case-by-case basis where you discuss with your healthcare provider, this is my past medical history, this is what I'm worried about, these are my concerns, to be able to make that determination about whether you proceed with the vaccine in those cases.
So it sounds like you're promoting that if you're in that situation, to very definitely establish a very close relationship with the medical professionals that you have and make use of them as much as possible.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That sounds like that's good advice. But no, especially in this case, I think that would be very helpful because of the ambiguity, and we do get a lot of this from members that are on maternity leave and things. So there is a hesitancy then, and the question comes especially when the mother's breastfeeding and they need to return to work, and then there's those other pressures that start to bottleneck a little bit. Just a reminder to everyone present, we have a number present, please do not hesitate to ask any questions. No one's asking questions yet, which is a concern, so please ask questions, or we'll be finished in about 5 minutes, which is not the goal this evening. So please ask questions. We're here, we have infectious control experts, so this is the opportunity to have any concerns that I have not yet covered or that we've not yet had submitted. So those are. Sorry, Dr.
Okay, I was just going to add one comment to Dr. Wren's summary of the pregnancy, or the breastfeeding and pregnancy for that matter, is that as she mentioned, pregnant and breastfeeding women were not included in the clinical trials, but despite that, a number of expert societies, including the Society of Obstetrics and Gynecology of Canada and other countries, have looked at all the evidence available and recommend, as Dr. Wren mentioned, that the potential benefits outweigh a theoretical risk because it's unknown, because they weren't involved in the study. So they're recommending the vaccine in pregnancy, or for pregnant and breastfeeding women, with following a good discussion with your provider about the risks and benefits on an individual level. So a lot of really smart obstetrics and gynecology people favor the vaccine in those groups as well.
That's very reassuring, and I think that is reassuring to hear that.
Ian, there's a couple of questions I wondered if we could follow up on, and there's a couple in the chat. But one of the questions that have come up previously is there's been a lot in the news about the AstraZeneca vaccine, and is it safe, and does it increase your risk of blood clots? And Dr. Wren, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So blood clots are a common medical problem, especially in older people. And therefore, it's likely that some of the people who receive the vaccine will at some point in the future develop a blood clot for reasons that are not related to the vaccine. And a lot of this data has been reviewed by the blood clot experts in Canada, so the Thrombosis Canada group, as well as the Canadian National Immunization Group, also known as NACI, who agree and recommend that you should be offered you should take the AstraZeneca vaccine should you be offered it. I think one really important thing to note is that we do know for sure that COVID will increase your risk of blood clots. So the overall picture would be that getting the vaccine and preventing a COVID infection would probably actually reduce your risk of blood clots. I'm not sure if Dr. Gough has anything else to add on that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely on the money there. And Thrombosis Canada has actually crunched the numbers. And as you said, COVID itself can cause blood clots. So what they estimate, that is, if these data from the AstraZeneca study pan out, the risk of getting a blood clot with the vaccine they found in all of the groups was about 1 in 250,000 to 1 in 500,000. Whereas if you have COVID and you're outside of the hospital, the risk is really high at 1 in 100. And if you're hospitalized with COVID, the risk of having a blood clot is about 1 in 10. So I agree with you totally that COVID itself is a higher risk for blood clots than the vaccine, if it proves to be true.
Thank you. So there's a couple questions in the Q&A. For those people who are at risk and they have a chronic condition such as diabetes, and they're within the phase 2 of the vaccine rollout, is there a vaccine that has been identified for them specifically? Melody, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So I think the question is alluding to whether or not of the 3 currently or 4 currently approved vaccines, although we don't have the Johnson & Johnson one yet, would there be a preference for one vaccine over the other? Is that the correct? Yeah.
And especially if you have a particular chronic disease, is there one that's better or not?
Yeah, so I think at this point in time, you should be taking any vaccine that you're offered. I don't think you will be offered at this point in time in Ontario a choice. Certainly the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine are probably more widely spread. We're slated to get some of the AstraZeneca vaccine later this week, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine won't arrive in Canada until later this spring. So I think at this point in time, what I would say is you should get the vaccine that you're offered, and that there hasn't been any clear evidence one way or another that specifically, for instance, for someone with diabetes, that one would be necessarily better than the other.
And related to that, Kevin, I wondered if you wanted to touch on Melody's mentioned that there's basically 4 different vaccines, and people have been wondering about, do they get to choose, and what happens? Is there a difference across the 4? Is there one better than the others?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's a common question. So, and the short answer is get anyone you can get, as Melody had mentioned. But if you look at the original data around Pfizer and Moderna, you might remember they quoted numbers around 94, 95%, and that was in preventing any sort of COVID at all. And the AstraZeneca and Janssen were somewhere in the 62, 67 or 9%. So people were thinking it's less effective. But the most important outcomes, whether you end up in the hospital or die from this, they are 100% effective in preventing. So all of the vaccines do that. So I agree, get the one that you can get as soon as you can get it. If you have an immune deficiency or diabetes, is one better than the other? No, I agree with Dr. Wren as well that one hasn't been proven to be better than the other. So I think the take home is they all prevent the really bad things like ending up in the hospital and dying from COVID. So they all do that very well.
So that relates to another question in the chat box around, can somebody with autoimmune disorder, can they receive the vaccine or not? And what are the risks? Melody, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So I think a lot of it would depend on the specific autoimmune disorder that you have in relation to also the medications that you might be taking at that time. Certainly, if you have a specialist who's following you for this, that's a discussion to have with them. But I would say that generally, there are no contraindications for the general broad class of autoimmune disorders in taking the vaccine. But certainly, if you have any questions or concerns with regards maybe to the medication that you're on, in addition to being on the vaccine, that you should touch base with your healthcare provider who is following you for this autoimmune disease.
There were a couple of other questions that came in prior. One was, can you talk about why it's okay now to have the delay between dose 1 and dose 2 of the vaccine? Kevin, do you want to do that one?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with that one. So the original, you'll remember the original studies that were done with the vaccine sort of recommended getting the dose around the 3 to 4 week mark and up to 12 weeks with the AstraZeneca. And what was considered in extending the dosing interval was how much vaccine do we have now, and kind of weighing the benefits between getting more people, getting that first dose into more people versus not, and also looking at how effective the vaccines are after a single dose. So what was learned that after the single dose of the vaccines, of the 2-dose vaccines, the effectiveness approaches about maybe up to 70, 80% by 2 weeks after getting it. And so far, it looks like that protection is extended at least beyond 2 months, around the 2-month mark. The 4-month results are still pending. So Health Canada and a number of other agencies around the world have looked at this and said, well, it looks like it's working. And this makes sense from other multi-dose vaccines that we use, like hepatitis B vaccine, for example. We know that the most bang for your buck you get after the first dose, and the rest sort of boosts that, reinforces it, and makes it last for longer. So in the case of the COVID-19 vaccine, after the first dose, it looks like to about 2 months at least, perhaps longer. There's about 70–80% effectiveness. And that was balanced with getting the more people vaccinated in the community to build up that herd immunity and to reduce the risk of other infections happening in the community, especially with the variants increasing in number. So that was the decision. They looked at the available data. They're continuing to look at the data. So as more information becomes available at 3 months and 4 months to see how long that protection lasts, things might change. But based on the information that's available right now, it appears as though it's a reasonable thing to do given the situation that we're in, and that there is protection at 2 months and perhaps even longer, up to 4.
Thank you. So one of the participants asks, do you recommend that you should get the COVID test before you get the vaccine? Melody, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so I don't think it's going to be part of the regular routine for when you get the vaccine. Of course, if you're developing symptoms, if you had a really high risk exposure, you should be getting the COVID test independently. But I don't think we're necessarily linking those two in our minds saying, oh, if you get the vaccine, you should get the COVID test done. No, if you're asymptomatic, otherwise in contact with patients with proper PPE and just plan for a regular vaccine, you can do it without the COVID test prior.
Great, thank you. And Kevin, there's a question, why is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine 1 shot and the others are 2?
Well, it has to do with they're both viral vector vaccines, both the AstraZeneca and the Janssen, and it depends on the specific details of the virus, how it's made, of the vaccine, how it's made and how it works, which particular antigens they use or things that they put in the vaccine to stimulate the antibody. So, there are different vaccines that we take. Some are 1, some are 2. The short answer is it's a lot of things combined, what they use to stimulate the antibody response, how potent that response is, and therefore how long that antibody response will last. So there are other some vaccines are 1 dose, some are 2, and some are 3. And it depends on what type of vaccine and what stimulates that antibody production.
Great, thank you. Melody, next question, can somebody with fibromyalgia receive the vaccine?
Yes, I would say someone with fibromyalgia can receive the vaccine.
Great, thank you. Somebody else has asked, can I still get COVID if I get the vaccine? Kevin, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. Your chances are much lower, but the answer is yes, you can. Theoretically, well, not theoretically, really. Remember, we talked about the efficacy of the vaccines being somewhere 94–95% for the Pfizer and Moderna. So that still leaves 5 or 6% unprotected. And then the other thing to think about is the variants. So what has been noted is that the currently available vaccines, although they have activity against the variants that have been reported, in some cases, the level of activity is reduced somewhat. So the vaccines aren't as effective against some of the variants. They still offer protection, but that protection is reduced from that 94–95% for Pfizer Moderna, and it can be in the sort of the 70–80% in some studies. So that would still leave you susceptible to those. So yes, you can still get it because nothing is 100%, and there are variants out there that the vaccines don't work as well against.
And so then the second part to that one, Kevin, is if so, can they spread COVID to others then?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. It looks like the vaccine does reduce, the early studies, they're not final yet, but it does reduce the carriage, how you carry COVID in your nose and throat, and how you can spread that. So it looks like it's reduced, but it's not reduced to 0. So these studies are ongoing. So that's why after we receive the vaccine, we're still required to wear masks and to physical distance and to practice good hand hygiene, because although they do reduce our risk of acquiring COVID-19 and potentially spreading it, it's not 100%. So it probably reduces the risk, and stay tuned because more information will come out about that.
Great, thank you. Melody, there's a question on, I'm on heavy doses of warfarin and have a mechanical heart valve. Is there any vaccine that I should be particularly cautious of, or that would be better for me?
No, I don't think that you would have to worry in the context of you having a mechanical heart valve and being on warfarin. I think it would be reasonable for you to receive any vaccine that you're offered.
Great, thank you. Kevin, the next question is, Pfizer has a study that came out today which says their data says their vaccine is effective only when the second dose is within 21 days of the first. And I would like to know the response to this, given that I'm scheduled to receive my second dose in July. Does this mean I would be called to reschedule my date to an earlier one, or would I have to repeat the first dosage in July?
I think the best way to give the vaccines is sort of according to the way they were studied. So for the Pfizer vaccine, it would be after 21 days. But even by their own data, they've shown that there is protection in the 70 to 80% mark out to 2 months. So I think the optimal protection would be if it's given as recommended, perhaps, but there is still protection after with an extended interval, as I talked about earlier. You would not have to repeat the first dose if you got it later. I think, was that the question?
Yeah, and are they going to be rescheduled to an earlier time period because of this?
I'm not aware that the government and people who are giving out the vaccine will be in any way rescheduling that second dose. But, I think it's important to keep in mind that this really, and you've noticed this yourself, and sometimes it can be frustrating, that things change quite rapidly. And things change quite rapidly because we're getting new information literally every day. And just as you mentioned, there was a study that was released. So a lot of new information comes out each and every day. So as of now, I'm not aware that they're changing the extended interval, but as the supply increases, that's likely that that will happen. But as of now, I'm not aware that that's happening. I don't know if anybody else has heard on the panel. But Melody, have you heard anything about? No, yeah.
No, and I think that just to emphasize what you said, I think things are changing so rapidly that certainly with new data coming out or with the change in supply, things could change, but nothing that I've heard of so far.
Great.
Thanks. So again, if people have any other questions, let us know. I have a couple of others that had come in previously. One was, Melody, can you answer, is there an issue if my first vaccine is Pfizer, for example, and my second dose is AstraZeneca? Is there any concern around that? And can that happen?
So most of the recommendations coming out are that if you start with one vaccine, we'll continue you on the second one. And all of the clinics that I'm aware of, and I'll have Dr. Gough also chip in here, are going to make every effort to make sure that you have both of the same both doses are from the same vaccine.
Yeah, I would agree. That is the current recommendation for sure. There are studies ongoing to see whether you can receive a different, like the Moderna after the Pfizer. So you can switch the mRNA vaccine, or you can take a different viral vector vaccine. Those studies are underway now, but as of now, it's recommended that you receive the same vaccine, and accommodations will be made for that, which is part of why the dosing interval was extended as it was, because of supply issues.
Thank you. So there's a question, Dr. Gough mentioned that there are vaccines that are better at protecting you against the variants. So which would those be?
I don't think that they're, I'm not going to say that one vaccine is better at protecting against the variants. I think what I meant to say is that of the vaccines that are studied looking at variants, there seems to be decreased effectiveness when it comes to some of the variants. So they might go down to about 70 or 80% from their higher, 90-ish% effectiveness. So there isn't one that's sort of recommended as being better for variants so far. What the companies are doing is that both with this messenger RNA or these mRNA vaccines and these new viral vector vaccines, they're rejigging the viruses for future and studying that to see if they can include a component that will also be effective against the variants that are being isolated. So they're looking at improving the current vaccines to provide some coverage for the variants. So I wouldn't recommend one over the other right now in terms of the variants, because, based on the information that's available today, one is not outshining any of the others in terms of that protection.
Great, thank you. So another question that came up previously is, and it relates to a previous point that you mentioned, Kevin, but I'll ask Melody about this, is what, will I need to get another vaccine next year? So is this like, 2 shots and done, or are we gonna need it again?
Yeah, so there are ongoing studies looking at the duration of protection after vaccination. So that answer isn't quite clear yet at this time. I don't think I heard anything or anticipate anything heading in that direction, but the formal studies are still ongoing to figure out how long are you actually protected after you receive the 2 doses or the 1 dose in the concept of Johnson & Johnson.
Great, thank you. And then another question was, if I had COVID in the summertime, do I still need the vaccine?
Yeah, I can.
Yes.
So yes, we would recommend that you still get the vaccine. The reason being is that it's not entirely clear what the immune response is across the board for people who've had COVID prior. And so we would recommend that if you do have the opportunity to get vaccine, to please get it, even though you've been previously diagnosed with COVID.
And just to add one comment to that as well, is that it looks like the protection afforded by the vaccine is even a little bit higher than if you've had COVID yourself. So there's more incentive to get it, is that it provides more protection than having COVID alone. So yes, I agree.
So there was another question that had come in earlier around, what about the impact of having the vaccine and on future fertility for young women? Is there any data on that? Because some people have asked about that as a potential concern in future.
So no data that I'm aware of, and certainly as vaccine rollout continues, they're doing population-wide monitoring to make sure that things like adverse events are being captured, but nothing that I think would be concerning from that perspective. I'm not sure if Dr. Gough has anything more to say on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There are no data whatsoever to support that. There's been some stuff floating around social media that was completely not founded in any fact at all. So that's been looked at, as you mentioned, and continues to be looked at, but no effect on fertility that's been proven.
There's a question. I'm not sure that I'm reading it correctly, but I think the question is, can I still have an allergic reaction 1 month after receiving the vaccine? And Magdalene, let me know if that was what you meant. Oh, looks like that's the question. Yeah, go ahead. So can you see an allergic reaction to the vaccine 1 month after you get it?
I think, so can you still be allergic? So I'm wondering if and Magdalene, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you've had it and you have an allergic reaction and it still seems to be hanging on a month later, or if you got the vaccine and a month later you developed a reaction. So I'm going to assume it's the first, and I can address both. But if you get the vaccine, usually symptoms go away after a couple of days for most people. But it is possible, if you have a particular type of reaction, that you can have some ongoing muscle aches and flu-like symptoms and fever that can persist beyond that. I'd be interested to know what type of symptoms you're asking about or you're concerned about, because it may or may not be related to the vaccine. So that might be something to talk to your healthcare provider about. If you're asking if you get the vaccine now, can you have a reaction a month later? I think that would be very unusual for it to be from the vaccine.
Thank you. Melody, there's a question that the individuals in the UK who got blood clots from the AstraZeneca vaccine, how soon after the vaccine did they experience this?
So I might need to defer that question to Dr. Gough, because I'm actually would refer to his expertise for the exact timing.
Sure. They were mainly women, less than 55 years of age, and it occurred within the first 2 weeks, 14 days of their receiving the vaccine. Again, this is all preliminary data. It's being studied, more often. to continue to gather some information, but based on the numbers that were reported by the UK, it happened within the first 14 days.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from any of the attendees? If a person cannot medically receive the vaccine, can they lose their job?
Possible. I can answer that question, actually. That's more of a human resource question. Technically, yes, it can be a condition of employment that you're vaccinating from a health and safety point of view. So it can be made a condition of employment. If you feel strongly enough that you don't want the vaccine, you need to make that decision, and your employment, you're going to have to decide that one on your own. So yes and no.
And then the second part of that is, if somebody can't have the vaccine, should they be labeled by wearing total PPE, where people who've had the vaccine just wear mask and goggles or visor? I don't know, Kevin, do you want to answer that, or Ian?
Well, it's an excellent point when you're talking about labeling people, but I think the question is, and I guess the question I have is there anyone who in Canada should not take the COVID vaccine? I guess might be because we get a lot of people thinking special, I have this case, X, Y, and Z. Who, like, this is an excellent question in terms of rights issues on the workforce. If I don't have the vaccine for whatever reason, who can't get the vaccine? Is that even a valid question? If I may.
I think the only absolute contraindication to receiving the vaccine is allergy to one of the components of the vaccine, like the polyethylene glycol or whatever it is. If you have a known reaction to that, then it's absolutely contraindicated. Otherwise, they're relative contraindications, which means you need to speak to your healthcare provider about that to see if it's safe for you and if you can receive it. But there's very few reasons in people who would not be eligible to receive the vaccine.
So what, like, we're talking of only a very small minority across the country, like a few hundred people maybe? I'm not familiar with the allergy.
Yeah, based on the absolute contraindications, the number would be small, but there are, other relative contraindications that need to be considered as well in terms of people's hypersensitivity and allergies and that. So that would be something, that should be discussed with the provider.
And then there's another question. My second dose was postponed from April 2nd to June 8th. Is it because of shortage of vaccine? Melody?
Melody.
Yeah, so I think Dr. Gough sort of touched upon this. Certainly, I think it was a decision made to try to get as many people inoculated as quickly as possible while taking into consideration the supply. And the hope is that over the next few months, while the supply starts to increase, hopefully some of those intervals will begin to shorten.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from anybody? Or Ian, did you have any other questions?
My big one was actually asking about with regards to who should not get the vaccine. And I think that that question was answered. I guess the follow-up to that question would be, if you're would you know if you're one of those people? For example, like, would this be something, this allergy, would it be identified early on in your life, or would you, like, it's just, I know very little about it, but it's of extreme rarity. Like, is this?
Yeah, I would, suspect that most people that have received, these ingredients are common across vaccines. So if somebody's had a reaction to a vaccine in the past, they may know that, but not necessarily, which is why in part after you receive the vaccine, you're monitored for at least 15 minutes and for, if you're having some symptoms, longer. So people wouldn't necessarily know that up front. They might if they've had reaction to vaccines in the past. But if you look overall, the millions of doses that have been given, those types of reactions are rare.
Okay, thank you. No, I think the concern we have from members is that they're going to have a real allergic reaction, and they're just going to be at home when this happens. And is this normal? I think. Thank you for answering.
But yeah, and most of the reactions though that happen are immediate, which is why you're observed for 15 minutes minimum, and a bit longer if you're not feeling well or having some symptoms. So they usually happen right away. So I think if you're getting all of the clinics that are set up to give out the vaccine are prepared to treat people if they have an allergic reaction. So that's the reason why you're asked to stay for a little bit as well, knowing that the people there can treat you if you do have a reaction.
Great, thank you.
So there's a couple other questions. If we get the vaccine and we still get COVID, what symptoms can we anticipate? And would this be similar to the regular COVID symptoms, or what would you expect?
Yeah, so I think you should be monitoring yourself if you suspect you might have COVID. I would be looking for those similar symptoms as prior to the vaccine. So I don't think necessarily just because you have the vaccine, you have to be looking for any of the new symptoms.
And would the symptoms at all be impacted by age or comorbidities?
So yes, we do know that the symptoms and the severity of the symptoms that you have certainly can be impacted by comorbidity and age. I don't know that we have necessarily the data in a post-vaccine world, but yes, we do know that COVID-19 itself as a disease entity can present differently based on your age and your comorbidities.
So Kevin, there's another question around, there was a news report today indicating that the AstraZeneca vaccine may have been using outdated information to prove their efficacy. Do you have any information or insight on this?
Yeah, I heard that as well. And part of this was the UK submission to the FDA. The FDA really had to ride them to get the information that they needed, which kind of speaks to how strict they are about approving these. And they were wanting more information that they were given, and they wanted it sooner. And I think eventually they got it. And then there was a new study just yesterday. The American AstraZeneca data came out, and they showed an increased efficacy up to about 79%, I think. And again, 100% of the time preventing hospitalizations and deaths. So the outcomes that really count were there. So these are the US, their own data, their own studies on the AstraZeneca vaccine. So they're going to submit those to the FDA, and they'll be scrutinized as the FDA does. So yeah, I did hear those rumors as well, but I think the FDA just held off until they got the information they needed and it was submitted. So there'll be really current information from the American study that was just released yesterday.
Excellent, thanks, Kevin. Melody, if you have an autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis, should you get the vaccine?
I think if you have an autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis, it would be advisable to get the vaccine. If you're on certain medications for your rheumatoid arthritis, you might be able to talk to the person who's treating rheumatoid arthritis with regards to specific timing of the vaccine. But I would say just broadly, yes, you should be getting the vaccine if you have a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis.
Thank you. And Kevin, there's a question on how is it possible to create a vaccine this quickly?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I questioned that myself when these vaccines first came out. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that happens. And part of it is, I mean, they had, first of all, the platforms they use. They use this messenger RNA and now the viral vector. These have been used in place, well revved up, ready to go. So they didn't have to develop the means to make the vaccine. It was right there. They could go right away. There was a lot of cooperation around the world. Really smart people around the globe were sharing information, cooperating, doing work together to create these vaccines, and being successful at it. At one point, at least, there were 150 vaccine candidates that were in development. So of course, with that many, the odds of success are much, much higher, and that's proven out as well. I think the governments have dropped everything else, so Health Canada among them, and focused all of their resources, so human resources, time and money, on making these vaccines and getting them out to the public quickly. And so we know that if you drop everything else and you focus on one task, it's much easier to get that done. And I like to think, remember at the beginning, China built a brand new 1,000-bed COVID hospital in 10 days. So that's dropping everything else and putting resources into that. And the last time I checked on the internet, it was still standing. So that can be done, right? The other thing is the way the studies were process. So usually clinical trials can take maybe 7 or 8 years, these big randomized controlled trials, because they go through different phases of study. So there's a preclinical phase where there's testing in the lab and some animal studies perhaps, and then phase 1, where a few people are tested, you're looking at safety and efficacy, then phase 2, a few more people, and then phase 3 are these large randomized controlled trials. Ordinarily, all of phase 1 is done. The data are looked at. If it's safe, if it's effective, you move on to phase 2, do all that. If it's safe and effective, move on to phase 3, et cetera. And that's why they can take 7 or 8 years. What happened in the case of the COVID vaccines is they started to look at the data early. So let's say during phase 2, the safety data looked good, the efficacy data looked good, the vaccine was working. They would allow the third phase to start already while still collecting the data and analyzing it for safety during the second phase. So things moved along a bit sooner, but the important thing to know is that at the end of the study, no vaccine was approved or released for use until all of those phases of study were looked at in detail and they were all complete and the vaccine was safe and effective. So the process definitely was expedited, but corners were not cut in terms of safety and efficacy. So I think it may be the new way that clinical trials are done and vaccines are made because it worked really well.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. I think that's one of the things that's been so remarkable in the past year is that it's been, in some ways, it seems like it's been just this horrendously long year. But when you think about it, like how these things have developed and not just a vaccine, but treatments for COVID as well, you know, that there's been this amazing, amazing developments and amazing innovation across, you know, across Canada internationally has been, I think, fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Ian, there's a question in the Q&A. I wasn't sure if you wanted to answer, but so if somebody has had an anaphylactic reaction and they are instructed not to get the vaccine, why would they have to lose their job? I don't know, Ian, if you wanted to answer that one.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it is a very specific rights issue with regards to, first of all, if you have a reason you're not able to get that, so assuming anaphylactic shock is a legitimate reason that you're not able to get the vaccine, so this is not for you. That's the first question. So then the next question is, will this impact your employment? Possibly you may have to take on PPE. However, as we were learning this evening, we're very early in the contagion element of how this works. So HR policies right now have not been developed in most long-term care facilities to specifically address those issues. I think what we're going to be seeing for the next little while, and what we're going to be recommending as an association, is that PPE should be uniform across that to prevent these kind of disparities and to protect the privacy of those who are not able to do it. So I would have to question why your home is making you wear a different color gown to identify that. That's concerning, and I'm not sure about the justification. I'd be happy to discuss it with you after, if you can send me an email. I don't know.
Great, thanks. And I think that relates to Kevin's previous point about, you know, even with the vaccine, we're still, required to use PPE appropriately. So, so we would still want to make sure that that we're doing that. There's a question. I'm allergic to penicillin. Is it okay for me to get the vaccine? Melody?
Yes, it's okay for you to get the vaccine.
Great. Excellent. Any other questions? Ian, did you have any others?
I have one question I was going to ask, and of course, the moment I want to ask it, it slips my mind. What's the best source of information to go to? So people have hesitancy. We get this. Oh, that was the question. I'm so sorry. That's the next one we'll ask her. The most reliable sources for people to go to get vaccine. We can answer that in a second. But we've been getting questions that relate to the vaccine, but they haven't been formally asked, for older individuals that are still working in the field, but they may have suffered some sort of traumatic illness in the past, such as they've lost a lung for illness, or they've had a triple bypass. The reaction for some of these individuals is, I'm not getting it. I'm just not. So what do and I've been confronted with that, and I really have nothing to tell these individuals. I'm not sure what to say. What can I say in that concern, in that position?
I think just to build on what Dr. Wren had mentioned earlier, is that having these comorbidities, we call them, where you've got heart disease or you have lung disease, and if you happen to get COVID, it makes it worse for you. People that have these comorbidities often develop more severe disease and can have poor outcomes from that. So balancing, in my mind, the risk of getting severe COVID versus a vaccine that hasn't been, in the example that was given, a bypass or something, hasn't been proven to be any worse for you. I think I would talk about those risks and benefits. And I think in that case, the benefits of getting the vaccine far outweigh the risk of getting severe COVID with those comorbidities. Because the vaccine's not proven to be more problematic in people who have those comorbidities, but getting COVID is. I don't know, Melody, if you want to add anything as well, but.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with what Dr. Gough said. I think, and I'm not sure, Ian, if this is what you were getting to the question, but everyone has vaccine hesitancy for different reasons. So always trying to get to the bottom of those reasons can sometimes be helpful. But certainly emphasizing the points that Dr. Gough has said, I think would be important.
Well, I think from an association, thank you, but I think from an association's point of view, the concerns generally are a mixture of, we're faced with a lot of different vaccines from different companies coming out within the same period of time, a number of different conflicting reports, and then we're dealing with a lot of disreputable news that comes out at the same time, trying to incite fear. So despite it all, I mean, that being said, so where should, like, I'm a new Canadian, let's say I'm new to healthcare. We work with a lot of new internationally educated nurses. English may not be their first language. What's their source? Where do they go if they need more information? Of course, they can always reach out to the OPSWA, no problem, and they're welcome to do so. We encourage that. But in terms of media, is there a good source that they can go to? I know that's a loaded question. I don't mean to put anyone in a corner, but like generally we're looking at the major news stations. We can rely on that. Is there anything that they should not avoid, like where they should get their information? Like, I don't know, that's a tough question. More like.
Yeah, no, I think I'll start, Melanie. You can, if you don't mind, just chiming in if you have any. But I think it depends on the type of information that you're looking for. If you're looking for, things around access, certainly the provincial government or the City of Toronto for local access, but around efficacy and safety, I find that that's the oversight for that is with Health Canada. So I find that Health Canada, the information on the Health Canada website, sort of looks at all the international reports that have come in, like from the UK, from Australia, and from the United States, and pulls that together and offers an opinion for Canadians, what's best for Canadians. So they look at the safety data, they look at the efficacy data. And then in terms of the local access distribution piece, obviously the city or the provincial government here. But it really depends on kind of what you're looking after. But you're absolutely right. There's so much out there in the misinformation out there that if you find something and you're not sure what it is, phone, email something, talk about it, clarify what that is, and try to clear up any misconceptions. Melody, did you have any other sources that you recommend or have used that you find useful?
Yeah, so I think, like you said, all the sources that I think are probably most reliable are going to be those government sources. So whether that be Health Canada, Public Health Ontario, or more locally on the Toronto public health level. But yes, I think I just agree with everything you said.
Yeah. I just want to add one comment as well, and this has come up before, is the vaccine permitted and recommended by those practicing different religions? And I think there's another source of information for you as well. And I'm going to look at my paper here because I think, and this is in the document I know that's come out of Sharon's group and at St. Mike's, around many North American faith-based communities recommend or permit vaccination. And among these are the Canadian Muslim COVID-19 Task Force, the Orthodox Union and Rabbinical Council of America, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the Hindu American Foundation. So if you have questions related to, can I take this vaccine from a religious perspective, then I would encourage you to check with your religious leaders and also these sources that hopefully would be available on the internet if they have a website. But that's another reason why some people have had questions about receiving the vaccine as well.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's good.
Just one of the other things I wanted to mention in terms of resources, and so Kevin mentioned the some of the vaccine infographics that our group has created, and so we use a process where we co-create them with Ian and some of the other people from Ian's organization, including many PSWs and others, families of people with older adults and things. And in particular, I've put the URL for the website in the chat feature. So it's the wellnesshub.ca, and it includes information about not just the vaccine, but about some other resources that might be helpful as well. And in terms of the process that's used for this, it's a rigorous process where everything is evidence-based, but it also goes through a process where we make sure it really responds to the needs of the people that it's targeted for. So whether that's healthcare providers or family members, essential caregivers, it's really targeting those. So the infographic that Kevin mentioned is just in the midst of getting updated to include the latest information on all 4 vaccines now, and so that'll get posted shortly on the website as well. Related to that, there was a question as well about wanting to get a copy of the video recording of this session, and I know that Ian has said that will be made available, and Ian, we can post that again on the hub as well, and make sure that gets disseminated.
Once I figure out how to export the Zoom webinar, I'll do my best, and I will get it to you. Knock on wood. There is another question, Sharon, if it's about efficacy again, regarding incomplete view. There's concerns that AstraZeneca has incomplete view on efficacy. I think we did touch on this issue a little bit. And I think the issue is that and if you just want to follow up, Kevin, on that regard, it was just about the information from CBC that came in that said there was concerns about the data from that trial. Just to reiterate for those who may have.
Yeah, I think the issue was, I think as I recall it, is that they weren't getting all the information from the company that they wanted in a timely manner to approve it. So they pushed back a bit, got some more information. I think they're still asking, or if they're still asking for information, it won't be approved until they get what they want. And then the US data from yesterday were released as well. So I think that was their comment. Hey, we want some more recent data. They pushed back, asked for it, and I think they got what they were looking for. It just took more time than they wanted to, but the vaccine was not approved before they got the information that they needed. So, and then we have the more recent data from yesterday, which actually, it's still preliminary. It hasn't been peer reviewed yet and been published, but it looks like the efficacy is even higher. And in this group, they did include people over the age of 65. I think there were about 6,000 people over the age of 65 who had about an 80% response rate. So you'll remember with that vaccine, there was some comment about it not being given to people over the age of 65. Well, it looks like in the preliminary US data that there was substantial efficacy in that age group. So it seemed to work.
And there's another question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all.
There's another question about why is there such hesitancy to take the COVID vaccine? Melody, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think if there was a silver bullet to that question, if there was just a one answer fix all, there would be lots of research about it and lots of people working on it. I think people are hesitant for vaccines for multiple reasons. Certainly, I think we've all sort of heard about and experienced some of the sentiment around measles vaccine even before COVID had come out. So whether or not that be related to, misinformation that's more easily accessibly or available these days, in addition to mistrust of medical institutions due to issues with systemic racism in the past, I think that's a pretty complex question and is probably quite individualized for each person.
Thanks. Kevin, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually reflect that question back to the audience as well, so we can get some more opinions. I mean, I think some of the questions I think are touching on that, but if people are willing to share, why, if they're hesitant, what those concerns are around, I think that would be helpful. But I agree that there are a lot of factors that go into it for sure, and a lot of it is around mistrust, as was mentioned, or some of the issues that we touched on. How are these created so quickly? This isn't usual. Is it safe? some information that makes it in the media about, for example, the AstraZeneca not having the data presented on time to the regulatory bodies, all kind of create a bit of mistrust or doubt. So I think the way to, in my opinion, to approach that is to clear up that information, to ask questions, get the answers that you need to make you feel comfortable with your decision, whatever it happens to be. But I remember when these first, as I mentioned, when these vaccines first came out, I was like, okay, this is unusual. Got to read about this, got to hear about it, get those questions answered so that when you get that shot in your arm, you feel that you've asked the right questions and it's the right decision for you. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer for hesitancy, but the things that we can impact on, happy to help out in any way. And if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to send them after the fact.
I have a very sub question, and forgive me, someone asked me this question a while back, and I can't remember who asked me this, but it had to do with clots and regarding sickle cell anemia and clotting. Is there any sort of reaction between the sickle cell anemia and blood clotting? And then does that, as far as we know, and forgive me if I didn't ask that question correctly. I'm pulling terms from my memory here. So, but I do recall that there was a concern with linking sickle cell anemia with the AstraZeneca blood clots, and I'm not sure if there was anything on that.
Do you have an opinion on that one, Melody? Or
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, there wasn't any specific indication for the clots that were seen in the AstraZeneca case reports with regards to a specific diagnosis of sickle cell. And like we sort of emphasized before, your risk of probably getting these clots is going to be much, much greater if you actually develop the COVID infection. And so in those cases, it probably still is warranted to get the vaccine.
yeah, and I haven't read anything about sickle cell and clots either.
It was a question that came back. There was nothing that came up through anything in media. It was just something that
No, it's a good question.
a long while back.
It's a good question, but haven't heard anything myself. And neither has Melody.
Good to know.
So there's a couple items in the Q&A. So in response to Kevin, your question around reasons for vaccine hesitancy, I will still get the vaccine when I can, but I'm concerned with trusting AstraZeneca and how quickly they were able to produce the vaccines. It's a speed that we haven't seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. This was a speed that we hadn't seen in past. And I think that more and more, as more and more data come out, they still go through the rigorous process, and Health Canada has looked at, like, for example, when the blood clots were reported, Health Canada looked at the data, they had blood clot experts look at the data, and they feel that, okay, maybe there's something there, it's not proven, but the benefits still outweigh the potential risk. So that decision was made. When the American data from yesterday, now we're going to go through that same scrutiny, and we'll see, do they add anything to what we already know, whether it's beneficial or hazardous, and go from there. So this happens with drug development and vaccine development all the time, but you're absolutely right. It's happening sooner now, but remember what we talked about earlier, where people are dropping out a lot of other things to really focus on this. So I totally understand where you're coming from, but understanding the sort of thinking about the process, I think they're looking at things as fast as they can and making sure that we're not offered something that's unsafe to the best of their abilities.
Thank you. And then one more question. If you get a reaction to bee stings, for example, localized swelling, should you get the vaccine, Melody?
Yeah, so if you get some swelling around bee stings, what's happening around the swelling is that the components of the vaccine are going to be completely different than that. So you should still get the vaccine. There wouldn't be a contraindication. It would not be abnormal, though, for you to get some localized swelling around the area of the vaccine. But we wouldn't consider that to be a severe reaction. That's something that we expect to happen and usually goes away after 1 or 2 days. So the short answer is yes, you should get the vaccine.
And there's another question. Is there a reason why healthcare providers are getting the Pfizer vaccine when the general population outside of healthcare are getting a vaccine with lower efficacy? Kevin, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. I think when you look at how the vaccines came out and who the priority groups were, that partially explains it. So remember, Pfizer and Moderna came out first, and the priority groups for receiving any vaccine were healthcare workers. So that's what was available to them. I think when you're saying lower efficacy, you might be referring to the AstraZeneca, which has the sort of the 62-ish% quoted efficacy in terms of preventing symptomatic disease. So I think healthcare workers got Pfizer because it was available first and they were a priority group. And whether they got Pfizer or Moderna depended in part on what population you were in. I know that Moderna was preferentially given to long-term care facilities at one point and to remote areas in the country because of how it could be stored and transported. So that was part of it. In terms of getting things that aren't as effective, I just want to go back to the point that all of the vaccines that are available are 100% or close to it in terms of reducing the outcomes that matter. So preventing hospitalization and preventing death. So I don't think from that perspective that the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Johnson vaccine or the Janssen vaccine is worse than the other two in terms of preventing those outcomes. So I just want to emphasize that, because if I had a choice of getting any of the vaccine versus holding off for the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine, I would take whatever I could get as soon as I can get it, because those outcomes of hospitalization and death are real, and I would want to prevent that.
Agreed.
So it looks like no more questions. Ian, did you have any others?
I have no other questions from my end. It's pretty quiet. I think we can wrap up. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. Dr. Wren, thank you so much. I know we kind of did it short notice, but I think we'll be able to get a lot of questions answered, and very much hoping that we can reassure everyone that listens to this in the future that this is well planned out, that this was not a raced out vaccine. We're fortuitous that we were well positioned from SARS, essentially, that we had these infrastructures set up. And just to reiterate, there are almost nobody in Canada that should not be getting the vaccine, and you will know who you are. Most likely, that group has most likely already been identified. So for those with any concern, please consult more aggressively with your local healthcare provider and your local physician. And we have questions now coming up because, oh, I'm wrong, sorry. Oh, they're just thank you. Okay, you're welcome. Dr. Gough, Dr. Wren, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sharon, Straus, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just want to shout out, huge thank you to PSWs, and we know you're doing a ton of frontline work, and if there's anything that we can do to give back and help with that, whether it's information sharing, et cetera, please, by all means, feel free to go through Ian. I know after the last seminar, some people did reach out, and I was able to communicate with some people and answer some questions, so happy to do that again, but big shout out and thank you for what you do each and every day. So thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that sentiment. Thank you to all the PSWs for everything that you guys do for us.
They accept that, and they work hard, and yes, and they appreciate those words very much.
Yeah.
I know they're here right now. Dr. Straus, I didn't give you a proper introduction at the beginning, for which I feel bad for. I apologize.
No, not at all. But just wanted to echo my thanks, and thanks to Ian and your organization and all the PSWs. It's been great to work with you over the last year. so thank you.
No, it's been wonderful working with you both. I really thank you for stepping up and helping us with this. And let's hope we can calm the waters as much as we can going forward. And if we need to do this again, we'll do it again. No problem. All right. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And for
Bye now.
have a lovely evening.